Good day, whichever phase of the day you're in. I'm Carmel Borg, head of the Department of Arts, Open Communities and Adult Education. And on behalf of the aforementioned department, I welcome you to the sixth and final webinar in a series of 6 webinars, as I said, focusing on museum futures. I want to bring in Fondazioni Creative, the main collaborators, and Valletta Cultural Agency, the main sponsors, to welcome you on their behalf. For our department, this webinar series constitutes part of the Extension Studies program, and it links very well with our STAR Masters, which is the Master in Museum Education. It's also a prelude to our main event next year, slated for October 2021. This is the international conference, again, bearing almost the same name, MUŻE.X, Shaping Museum Futures. I'm very confident that this particular webinar will contribute substantially to our critical engagement with museums today and to our ongoing discussion on the possibility of our museums becoming more democratic, more just, more equitable, more diverse, and above all, museums which serve communities more than individual egos. I will stop here with my introduction, and I will give my invisible mic to Sandro De Mono, a friend, a colleague, a collaborator, and the co-anchor of this webinar series. Sandro.
Thank you, Carmel. Good evening, good morning, depending on which time zone you're in. It's a pleasure for us here in Malta, live from the Mediterranean, to welcome you all to the 6th and final webinar in this series, which we launched in mid-October and which we're concluding today. It has been a long journey. We've touched upon a broad spectrum of topics and subjects, including participatory, nature-inspired systems thinking, social commitment of the museum institution, the digital resiliency. And today, for our final webinar, it is my pleasure, it is our pleasure to welcome Kylie Bryant Greenwell from Smithsonian American Art Museum. She's the head of the public programs at this museum, along with Mike Murawski, our collaborator, our dear friend from Portland, Oregon. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Hello, hello. So glad to be part of this.
Fantastic. Hi, Kylie. Kylie is the final speaker today. She's well known for her social justice practice and her commitment to culture equity. And her topic, her title is, to mention the least, intriguing. I was very inspired, very caught by her choice of title. And that's, Dear Museum, Don't Be an Ally, Be an Anti-Racist. Kylie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen to share my slides. So I would like to begin with a good morning and a good afternoon and a good evening, depending on where you are tuning in from. For me, it is a beautiful early winter mid-afternoon here in Washington, D.C. And I am feeling more hopeful than I have in 4 years. But before we celebrate the possibilities of democracy, I must first begin with some thanks. It is such an honor to address this delegation of museum practitioners among a cohort of 6 museum leaders from around the world. I am truly humbled to be among this group. This conference serves museum workers worldwide across diverse disciplines and interests. I, however, have had the experience of working specifically in U.S. museums. So I'm going to first ask that you understand my perspective and my bias coming from that, and let you know upfront that while I believe there are things that I will share about my practice that are useful for your own practice, if you are in fact sick of American politics and American racism, this is not the presentation for you. I decided to focus this talk on my own practice instead of my work. I could tell you lots about different public programs and their impacts, but I thought it would be more useful to dissect my practice, motivations, perspectives, and my hopes and dreams for the future of museums, as this is a conference that is looking to shape museum futures. Developing a practice is a constant exercise of putting values into action. I'm going to begin this conversation with a lengthy discussion of museum values, and especially in terms of racial equity. I want to preface this with just a little bit about racism and anti-racism. I'm going to be discussing anti-racism at length, and I don't believe you can have such a discussion without also speaking about racism in specific details. And as I said, I'm speaking from my lived experiences in U.S. museums, but this is an international conference, and racial equity is an international issue. We have seen through the last decade of news headlines that across the UK and Europe, and not just in Western cultures, across Asia as well, racism is still flaring up as an issue, especially when we think to consider their role in racial equity. So I believe this discussion is for everyone. Black Lives Matter is a universal call, not just an American one. So there's something for everyone here. So first, I'd like to thank Sandro for inviting me to speak, and also for the lovely introduction. I also want to thank Mike Borowski for arranging questions and dialogue following this presentation, but also for being a supportive and caring museum leader, for committing to challenging the status quo and helping others build a practice to do so. If it were not for Mike and his Museums Are Not Neutral partner, Latanya Autry, I would not have the resources necessary to build my practice. This presentation consists of references to the tireless work of so many museum leaders and cultural equity specialists. So I encourage you to check out those links as they pop up in the chat. And also want to thank my mentors and colleagues and other bold fellow change makers who are the driving force to getting museums to a new future. Oops, sorry. So I wanted to take a minute to introduce my museum, as I will start more broadly about the sector. I want to first give a moment to my institutional support. The Smithsonian American Art Museum celebrates the extraordinary creativity of artists whose work reflect the American experience and global connections from colonial times to present day. SAM is one of 19 world-class museums, galleries, gardens, and a zoo that make up the Smithsonian Institution. A core question that many Smithsonian museums, have been grappling with for years is, what does it mean to be an American? In the context of current events, concurrent pandemics, one of a global public health crisis, and the other of the many countries' original sin of racial inequality, this question is ever more fraught. I have been asking museum practitioners to sit with questions of power in terms of museum reform for years now. This presentation is another interrogation of power, but like many, I have been finding new ways and new modes of questioning in this year of strangeness and loss and of newness. I find myself returning back to this question. Why are we here in this moment, in this crisis, in this polarization, in this divisiveness, in this uncertainty? Why are we here? As I mentioned earlier, this is a dual crisis of pandemics. With the global health crisis still raging, you may ask, why do I choose to focus on the other pandemic? Though we still have a long way to go to secure the health of the global population, we can now see a bit of hope on the horizon. However, the hope and promise of a vaccine doesn't mean we're totally out of the woods yet, especially when we think of how museums will respond. In her 2007 book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, author Naomi Klein explains that a shock doctrine utilizes periods of disorientation following wars, coups, or global pandemics to push through pro-corporate reforms and aggressive policies that diminish the wellness and position of the greater good. Why does this matter for museums? Well, for one, we can already see the effects of the shock doctrine diminishing our values. A huge number of museums have already resorted to mass layoffs to preserve their institution's financial position. Many of the positions being cut across the museum field are in education, community engagement, and audience programming, the roles where our values of democracy and humanism and equity are most present. The long-term shock of this loss of these positions, positions ourselves as a museum against our own values. I believe that if we look at the work of museums as change work, most museums should instinctively know how to respond to science and even science denial. This is well within our wheelhouse of documenting human activity, but we must all be diligent in driving these values. While there is so much to unpack on the global pandemic in museums, I would like to focus on the role of museums playing in the racial pandemic. Museums have demonstrated time after time, in increasingly public ways, their unpreparedness in addressing an ongoing pandemic of racial inequity. So that's where I focus my energies and my practice. For the past 6 months, I have been building the architecture for a new initiative to be launched at the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum, to be launched next year, called Transforming America, Addressing Racial Inequality. The 5-year project to advance local communities' collective power to create positive racial change. Organizing and liberation theory and critical race theory are the foundations of the project. And as such, I've been rereading many of these key texts and spending a lot of time processing equity teachings this year. The way we think about our work in museums plays a definitive role in developing our practice. As I said earlier, a practice is an exercise in putting values into action. So I want to talk first about some new ways of thinking about museum work and how that can impact our practice. There's a theory of change that states that liberation and social justice are an ongoing journey, not a destination. The call to action is then that we must all hold ourselves accountable to the responsibility to consistently be creating our liberated worlds. This is something that is applicable universally. Another way of thinking about this is if we are always practicing liberation, then we are in the active action of keeping oppression at bay. The rise of nationalism and xenophobia have us questioning what we thought we knew about our democracies. And I think that question extends to what we think about museums. Why does today feel like 1939 again? Like 1950s America? Because it is. Social justice and liberation are on perpetual cycles. We are clearly in the midst of a challenging phase and cycle. So the question then becomes, what are our museums answerable for? What is our responsibility? And how do we hold ourselves accountable? Now, I never want to conflate any one issue with another or speak too broadly about the nuances of oppression, but my practice is centered on racial equity, and I believe there are lessons that can be applied widely. Racism is expressed universally. Inequities are experienced globally. So I believe you can take lessons from racial equity studies in the US and find meaning everywhere. So for the large population of European listeners to this conference, I hope that what I share will be useful to you. Earlier, I referenced Mike's work with Museums Are Not Neutral. In museum discourse today, we can see a framework for the concept of neutrality. This is one area where I think we need to look beyond museum teachings for a more equitable structure of what it means to be neutral. I titled this presentation, Don't Be an Ally, Be an Anti-Racist. One of the most well-known anti-racist scholars is Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He theorizes that there are only two positions when it comes to racism, racist or anti-racist. Kendi dismisses the existence of non-racist or neutrality with the theory that if the action in question doesn't purposefully dismantle oppressive structures or attempt to do so, then it supports the status quo and is therefore racist. So if we take Dr. Kendi's teachings to heart in museums, we can interrogate our practice as either racist or anti-racist. This is a challenging concept that I've come to embrace in my own practice, and I thought I would talk about my journey with it. First, one of the hardest conceits we have to transform for a more liberated way of thinking about museums is to abolish the limiting framework when we think of racism as good versus bad. Racism, having been baked into the very foundation of American structures and institutions, and that includes museums, is systemic. If we look more broadly globally, all countries with imperialist and colonialist backgrounds have a legacy today of racial equity to address. It's far more complex than good or bad. Racism is harm. It is also often the default position in a society constructed on white supremacy. So, racism is harm. Racism is default. Our American default is racism. It inherently exists across all facets of our lives. Rather than focus on the idea that we are all racist, we need to come into an active relationship with the hard truth that we all have the capacity for racist impact, which is harm. We all have the capacity to default to harm. That's where I think museums need to do some serious work. In a society built on racist values, what matters is what we do about it. Consider what this means for museums. Our default systems, processes, and procedures cause harm. If our default is harm, then no amount of integration is going to transform us. We must begin to originate our practices in equity, not integrate equity within. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Still today, we're using the couple of bad apples rationality that racism is a heinous act committed by vile people rather than the systemic and structural mode in which society exists. Which brings me to the inevitable place of the 2020 US presidential election results. With the very, very close final results from a very polarizing cycle, we're hearing a lot of rhetoric like half of America is racist, or at least half of Americans don't believe racism is a deal breaker. We need to sympathize with racists because they almost won. This is a map from an ongoing project documenting US cities and other institutions where racism has been declared a public health crisis. I would like to see the follow-up to this study about the impacts on museums, and specifically museum practice in those cities. Now, I'm not a political scientist or a pundit, and I legally can't comment on partisan politics as a federal employee. But I am a museum worker. And museum work is race work, which I'll get more into later. Museum work is current events, is cultural equity, is memory work, is community work. All elections impact museums. If the country believes that this election has racial equity on the ticket, then museums are even more directly affected. If your country's rhetoric is consumed with fear of isolationism, nationalism, of human rights violations, you can be sure your museums are affected. If your country is looking at harmful ideologies like racism as a public health crisis, you can be sure your museums play a role in that. In Europe, we've seen through audiences this outrage over monuments, with activists toppling flavor monuments from the UK to France and even more globally. This work is museum work. It's happening outside our doors, outside our control, but it is museum work. Therefore, those of us working in US museums do need to take a long, hard look at this election, its polarization, and its implications for the big question: who are we? And more importantly, who do we want to be? If ever there were proof that racism is far trickier matter than a couple of bad apples, I think these results would be it. There was a recent Washington Post article interviewing former neo-Nazis that revealed even card-carrying white supremacists don't like being called racist, which at first was strange, but then had me deeply concerned. If you've made your life's work racism, and you still don't like being called racist, what does that mean about our understanding of racism? If I can push our sensitivities just a little bit further on this, can we see the connections of the museum to the ex-neo-Nazi? Museums once dealt explicitly in the business of cultural theft and harm, explicitly in the business of cultural theft and harm. Yet we vehemently dismiss any ties to that former life. If racism remains this taboo ultimate evil that we can't ever discuss its existence, let alone its vice grip on society, how can we ever develop a practice that directly and actively dismantles it? I don't mean this question just for American democracy. I think this is a question that deeply affects global museums. We become defensive and exasperated when we're called racist, and I'm speaking as museums here. We resent the accuser and make a show of proving all the ways we're not racist. which is often a racist position itself. Instead of taking the feedback which is being given, that is, you stated that your values are to be inclusive of all people, and I'm letting you know that you missed the bar here. If we look at the construct of default harm, then our directive is not to try to preserve our default harm, but to actively try to dismantle it, and in the process, discover and activate new ways of museuming. If we look at the big picture of museums, we can see the potential for harmful impacts. If our actions are racist, then we have caused harm. When we categorize our actions and our practices within museums this way, what is the outcome? I think we would have to include, or at least I have to include, that museums are racist. Now, here's where my practice comes in. In the simplest of terms, I'm actively using an OODA loop in my practice of liberating harmful museum norms. Tactical theorist John Boyd developed the process of the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, act. In this process of observing museum behaviors, orienting myself to liberated values, deciding to dismantle harmful norms, and acting for change, I'm continuously living in the belief that museums can and should be equitable. So museums have the great potential to be institutions of equity. I have spent years defending the concept that museums are in fact supposed to be cultural equity institutions. What would it take for museums to transform as cultural equity institutions? What would we hold as our greatest asset in achieving this? Our world-renowned collections, the significant, one-of-a-kind, meaningful objects which we care for? Will our objects set us free? I don't necessarily believe that objects have anything to do with cultural equity. Cultural equity is defined by our relationships with visitors, with non-visitors, with staff, with funders, with each other. Relationships are key to cultural and racial equity. Which finally brings me to the title, Don't Be an Ally, Be an Anti-Racist. So you could ask, as museums, why can't we just be allies in solidarity with movements and communities? Certainly allies are practicing anti-racism. To which I respond, of course, allies can be anti-racist. But what is the relationship of the ally to the movement or community in question? The position of ally is inherently adjacent to, bordering, neighboring. An ally is complementary, a bystander. An ally has the choice of detachment. The position of anti-racist is inherently within. There is no choice of detachment. But more importantly, the position of anti-racist is immersed in the cultural moment with the directive of active engagement. Far too much museum rhetoric suggests that museums are watching this cultural moment unfold within communities. That cultural strife occurs just outside our doors and outside our obligations, as if we hold immunity to inequity, let alone that we could be a perpetrator of it. When we worry about the past creeping into our present, do we remember what happened to museums in 1939? We are not immune, nor are we a victim. Museums are as much responsible for this cultural moment as any other institution. So what do we do now? We learn from our mistakes, but more importantly, we learn the lessons that other fields that study racism and inequity have been trying to teach us for decades. What can Black Lives Matter teach us about new ways of being Liberation theorists consider a spectrum of sources for framing an equitable futures. Nature, systems, galaxies. Complexity thrives in diversity. Now museums must open up to different thinkers and ways of being outside our limited institutional norms. We're all familiar with the old adage that insanity is the act of doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results each time. So what do we keep doing wrong? For one, we keep insisting that race work and museum work are separate work. Secondly, we keep insisting that DEI, or diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, integration, is the way. This is probably the most controversial thing I will say this whole talk. That I believe it's time we pivoted away from the framework diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion for the practice of racial equity instead. Consider with a critical race lens, what has your organization's DEAI approach done for liberation and transformation? What have been the results of starting a task force for DEAI, other than further siloing equity work, which I'll talk more later? In approaching this work with a real plan grounded in established equity practice. Without doing that, we're never serious about transforming museums. As I said, I believe that museums are inherently cultural equity institutions, and as such, I believe the work that we must do is racial equity work. However, for at least the last decade, we've made very little transformation with our current approach, which is that to integrate equity into existing oppressive beings. Instead of examining our practice, our process, and our behaviors, and interrogating the harmful structures therein, we've tried to maintain oppressively authoritative norms while pushing a framework of equity that has never been tested. This has allowed for racist norms to persist within our practice. And I want to discuss in depth just two specific ways that I have witnessed this work persisting in our work. Last year, you may have seen this screenshot from an anonymous disgruntled visitor to an unknown plantation historic site or museum in the US South. For accessibility, it basically says that this person did not enjoy their visit to this museum or cultural center because the tour involved a discussion on the legacy of slavery therein. As the rise of the movement for Black Lives has shown us this year, especially in the US, we have never reconciled with this dark history of colonialism and slavery. But globally, very few countries have gotten very far in this reconciliation either. As such, museums are profoundly affected by an audience with broadly varying beliefs of history. Some museums, like the one referenced here, have boldly taken up the challenge of retelling our past to reveal uncomfortable truths of how we became the country we are today. Many museums, most museums, have not followed suit. Perhaps it's the fear of embittered visitor responses like this that holds museums back from challenging a very widely held notion that slavery wasn't such a bad thing, or that slavery didn't happen here, or slavery is another country or another institution's problem. But likely the root of the problem is planted far deeper. I follow a lot of race experts on Twitter. So when I saw this post, it was framed within their insights as racial scholars. So the presumed white woman's disgruntled response to being educated on the horrors of slavery is, in this framework, the epitome of white privilege and power. The idea that a Southern plantation museum can divorce the study of the ongoing legacy of slavery from an idyllic walking tour of the grounds that were built by enslaved people is an idea that can only come out of the most egregious privilege and power, and it's an idea that museums can continue to perpetuate. Those directly affected by racism are not likely to compartmentalize its reality within the world, but museums are guilty of this compartmentalization. One of the challenges known to museum equity advocates is the misconception that museum work and race work are somehow not the same thing. I've personally experienced the segregation of museum work and race work throughout my career. This is a true story. I was once working at a very small historic house with a curator working on a comic books exhibition, and noticing the lack of diversity within the scope of the show, I suggested a local Japanese American and an El Salvadorian American artist for inclusion. The curator responded to me that it was impossible to include these artists because once you start adding in the Japanese guy and the South American guy, then you have to add the Black guy and the Mexican guy and the Middle Eastern guy, and it never ends. It never ends. Rightfully so. If in our hearts we approach a DEAI strategy or a racial equity strategy with the secret hope in mind that this work will end someday, that we can go back to whatever else we think we should be doing, then museums will never be anything but a prop to the status quo. But I know this anecdote is relatable as much as it is shocking or disturbing. How many times have we heard this exhibit is just about pottery or plant science or the historic use of thimbles? There's no room for a discussion on equity. That's a different story. Museums have a clever system of coded language for segregating the work of equity from the rest of the work to be done. This is also revealed in the areas designated for race and equity work in museums. Often we see equity work happening in educational departments or within roles who regularly engage with audiences. This is equity siloing. We silo or compartmentalize, or to use another trigger word, segregate this work. But truthfully, there are no segregated stories. The story of any object or artwork is only limited to the museum presenting it. But the full story is always there, whether we acknowledge it or not. If museum work is inclusive, diverse, and equitable, then it is race work. The second area in our practice that I'd like to focus on is in understanding racism as a matter of impact versus intent. When we do gain traction in recognizing that race work is museum work, we then insist that our good intentions will see us through. Someone very wise once said, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." I think that this graphic here helps us to understand how the majority of racism is expressed not through vicious intent, but through oppressive impacts. Mistakenly, we believe that intent determines outcomes. But as we see continuously throughout the world, racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism are all measured, experienced, and function in terms of impact. Putting aside intentions and instead measuring the impact of museums yields an understanding of how colonized, exclusive, and discriminatory practices are centered in museum, despite the best of intentions. The institutional opinion of record is not stated in a good intention soundbite. It's what's said in curatorial selection, pedagogy, marketing, and even in the provenance of funding. This is what it means. This is what remains the record of who an institution is and what they stand for. As previous Me Too and Black Lives Matter museum scandals have demonstrated, what follows a good intentions apology is often some posturing on the rightful way to serve communities while upholding objects with problematic narratives. We know that such rationale doesn't lead to radical, decolonized, empathetic, inclusive, and non-authoritarian conversations about the accountability of institutions. Furthermore, it is impossible to deny the role of institutions, such as museums, will play in the broader cultural shift towards equity. This is where we need to look outside ourselves for guidance. Critical race theory teaches us that impact exceeds intent. The invisible powers of institutions to minimally support racially impactful art and objects and still pretend or play at being community-minded is more telling of how power and oppression functions than the openly racist rallies claiming space across Western discourse. To claim one's own goodness while supporting the impact of bigotry is the pinnacle of power and privilege. Achieving equity requires that we examine all prevailing racial, gender, binary, elite, wealthy, classist, ableist, heteronormative, discriminatory, and colonial practice in our society and in our institutions. For museums, that means realizing that unintentional racism is racism. I know that I'm listing a lot of adjectives here, but the first step in transformation is naming the problem. We need to get comfortable naming museums as they are: racist, elitist, exclusionary. Recall that earlier I concluded museums are racist. This is the outcome of continued unchecked and unchallenged behaviors. When we focus on intent, we're trying to change opinion, but our liberation requires deeper resolution. In anti-racism, we aren't solving for intent, we're solving for impact. We're changing the policies and norms that withhold equity. Equity requires that we collectively understand that seeking absolution from continual harm and harmful practice exemplifies our privilege. We must change our practice. If museums are really ready to take the next steps towards racial and cultural equity and anti-racism, it's time that we learn from critical race theory and other social justice practices. So what is the next step for museums? How might we envision a journey from ally to anti-racist? I'd like to amplify some of the work being done by grassroots museum organizers. First, on empathy. I am a contributor to the consulting collective Empathetic Museum, which is dedicated to holding museums accountable to their communities. Through writings and presentations and trainings, we help museums get into a more equitable relationship with community. I am recalling again my position on relationships, that museums are an exercise in relationships. Also, when we think of what museums must do now to get off the failing cycle of transformation, we must be in relationship with accountability. Museum A Site for Social Action is a grassroots collective of museum changemakers committed to anti-racist practice and dismantling white supremacy culture in museums. For full disclosure, I am also a proud partner in this disruption. We recently launched an accountability campaign in response to the eruption of Museum Black Lives Matter solidarity statements following the US national uprising and global uprising this summer with the police murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black Americans. This campaign, which began with an encyclopedic account of over 1,000 US museum public statements, interrogates museum accountability with racist practice, behaviors, systems, and norms. Knowing that museums in general approach racism and white supremacy inconsistently at best and rarely with lasting consequence, the Mass Action Collective is carefully reading museum statements and asking, what language are they using? What is their stated level of commitment to anti-racism? And most importantly, how does their stated commitment align with their actions? Again, not to conflate one issue with another, but we've witnessed museums broadly practicing equity washing. which is the white supremacy symptom of stating equity values, but dismissing change work internally and in practice. Equity washing is one of the more visible ways that we see patterns of museums struggling with accountability. For this campaign, once we have aggregated the data from the external facing statements and internal processes, we plan to release the information in a variety of formats in hopes that it will provide a coherent picture of the field-wide response and position towards anti-racism and racial equity. We say in our blog that in undertaking this project, we are grounding ourselves in radical hope. Anti-racism is an act of radical hope. It's an invitation to make a more equitable future. So I feel my practice is a practice of hope. So after all this discussion on practice and theory, I thought I would just end with a quick reflection on some of my work to date. And thank you for sticking with me while I pontificate on the role of museums. Last year at SAM, we held the biggest public program of our annual portfolio, the 5th annual SAM Arcade, which is a 2-day free and playable video game takeover of the whole museum. This year's theme was Breaking Barriers, which highlighted inclusive and diverse games from underrepresented creators in the gaming industry. We brought in indie developed games celebrating LGBTQ+ stories, narratives by people of color, and games that explore mental health issues. The focus was diversity in every form. In years past, SAM Arcade averages about 18,000 to 20,000 visitors over a 2-day weekend. Last year attracted over 24,000 visitors. That's a 20% increase for my data friends out there. The reason I highlight this success is that usually our hesitation to embrace anti-racism is rooted in the fear of decreased visitation. We think of that one visitor who left a disgruntled comment at the Plantation Museum. But when we focus our attentions there on that one visitor, we miss out on the 4,000 other visitors waiting for us to greet them with empathy. We all need to proudly share our diversity success stories, because the notion that diversity doesn't sell is 1, wrong, and 2, harmful. It holds us back from truly realizing a future where museums perpetuate justice and understanding. I've been able to embrace these principles of anti-racist practice because of my background at the intersections of museums, public programs, and social justice. In previous roles, I developed and launched the A Seat at the Table program at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a participatory program design that brings strangers together in dialogue about social justice issues over a family-style meal. Previously, I launched the Women, Arts, and Social Change Initiative at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, which sought to bring the museum into national discourse on social justice. Both of these programs resulted in bringing in brand new audiences to the museum. At NMAC, the program became a space for collective community healing. At NMWA, the program became a meeting space for civic-minded communities of thinkers. Both programs prove that the museum can be more than a place for object display and learning. That the museum can be a space for community connections, for collective therapy, for imagining and creating more equitable futures, for access to the democratic process, for catalyzing change. Do I think that programs are the cure for what ails us? Certainly not. Public programs are not the key to our liberated futures. For example, this example is for the art museums. We cannot produce an entirely all-white or all-male exhibition today in 2020 and expect to balance it with inclusive programming. Bringing in women artists of color in public programs after the fact does not absolve us from the sin of exclusive exhibitions. We need to share the same experimental, audience-focused energy of programs across the entire museum. Otherwise, we're just continuing the practice of equity siloing and exclusivity. But I like to reflect on these programs as a means to utilize the power that I have to contribute to our collective liberation in museums, something I think we can all do. I count my privileges that I've had the opportunity to build a museum career steeped in social justice, but I maintain that anyone can do it. And moreover, it is our inherent responsibility as museum practitioners to do so. So in conclusion, I want to reiterate that challenging the status quo as cultural equity institutions is what museums inherently should do. Forget about allyship, be an anti-racist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayleigh. I feel like there should be like loud applause or something. These Zoom-based programs can be, so tricky. But I know that I can speak for myself, and I think many people to say thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to let people know. Oh, good, yeah, add applause into the chat. That's awesome. Thank you, folks. I want to, make sure people know that they can add their questions into the chat, and then we'll make sure that we get to any questions that come up. So I hope that we can do that. I'll kind of start the conversation by simply saying, like, I'm so grateful to be in dialogue with you, Kayleigh. Your scholarship, your curatorial work, your education work is so pivotal and so important. So yeah, I'm just honored to be able to be in conversation and to talk about some of these like pivotal issues. Thank you for framing all of this so well. My brain obviously is just going in a million directions, and I just want to like sit down and like talk for the next hour. So I'll try to, think of a few. I'll narrow it down to a few things. But so one of the things that sort of I think about in terms of these issues, and I have been involved in thinking about this for a long time within museums, but then only recently from outside museums. I've been out of museums since about the beginning of the pandemic, and trying to use that as an opportunity to really continue to reflect on, I don't think it would be too bold to say like what's wrong with museums, to reflect on my own experiences, experiences of programs that I've led, community partnerships that I've worked to help support, and when things have gone wrong, or when things have gone in different directions, or when people are harmed and harm is happening. You're totally right. I think that is so key for people to recognize that like museums operate out of a basis of harm in so many instances and ways. And so as you were talking, I was just thinking about this sort of separation between kind of all of these different kind of surface behaviors. You named them all pretty much. Like it's taking this sort of, I would even call it like not, to use Kendi's language, like this not racist work of, we'll have education programs, we'll have the proper PR statement, we'll make sure we put a black square on our Instagram and our social media, we'll have let's have a token Black artist on our board, let's the list just keeps going on, and museums are in that space. You sort of refer to it as equity washing too. Like that's the way of saying like the sort of ex-neo-Nazi being like, I'm not a racist, don't call me a racist. And I've been getting so interested then in what's underneath the sort of surface level, like what is at the core then of museum structures, systems, legacies. And then I think, and you started in the beginning, you talked a lot about museum values. And for me, so much of the struggle, where transformation work doesn't happen, where liberation isn't connecting to museum practice, is when those two are just so misaligned. You've got, museum values that actually don't value equity. You've got museum core values. I mean, no one's even, in the most of my museum experiences, no one's even talking about what are the core beliefs and values and kind of philosophies that are underneath the surface of the people in positions of power. Where are their values coming from? Why is it that equity is always something off on the side, something maybe we'll have time for that, maybe we'll have a budget for that. And I say all of this because your statement around we must originate our practice in equity, to me speaks to that, those deeper human systems, those deeper core values and the foundations of where museum practice is coming from. So I'm curious about just your reflections on like that misalignment between sort of the deeper museum values and then all of the sort of equity washing and sort of not racist practices that are happening at the surface. And what are some ways to sort of start addressing maybe that misalignment, if you see that misalignment too?
Yeah, I think that the ways that we think about our work and approach our work are really important. If we, and this sounds kind of obvious, but if we really think about it, if we sit down on our computer every day, and I'm a development officer, and I sit down and I think, well, it's my job to bring in money, full stop, that's it, that's all I'm doing here, then that's where my energies are going, that's where my work is going. If I sit down at my computer, whatever my desk looks like every day, and I think my job is to create, is to advance racial equity in my community, that's my job, then that's where my energies are going. That's what my work is doing. And so I really think that we have to retrain ourselves in museums to be oriented to practice what we are, and praxis actually. So the theory and the practice coming together in action, because how we think about our work drives our work, that drives where our energies are going. And I think that we have over the years sort of assumed certain values, and that assumption I think is where some of the misalignment is coming from, because we haven't activated work around values. If we think simply of just the three letters in DEAI, we haven't activated work around diversity. We haven't activated work around equity or inclusion or accessibility in any meaningful way. And so we have to move past those assumptions and really get into the work of doing work that is based in our values. And that's why I use the liberation model, because you know, in liberation theory and practice, the action of doing that every single day, of sitting down, I'm going to do what I can to promote racial equity, that is the living embodiment of liberation. And so I think we've been thinking in museums like, we'll get there someday, it's a point on a map down the road. And I think that mentality is holding us back from really doing the work.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think, yeah, I mean, someone commented even in the chat, you know, what if you don't have stated values? Or I would even say somewhere deep down in some strategic plan or on your museum website, you have values, but and I'm speaking from an art museum field, and I know you spend a lot of time in art museums as well in the US, but the values can often be accountability. And it's funny that that's a value when we're talking about what we're talking about, excellence, innovation, access, these buzzwords, but most staff aren't even aware that those are values, but they certainly never talk about them, and they certainly don't agree. Like, there was never a conversation in any museum that I've worked for that was, what are the people's values that make up this institution, and how do we bring them together around cultural equity? Like, how do we make sure that we are thinking about that? And what you said about like development officer, that's like that sort of frames it so well, because I think museum workers think of their jobs as just like they're, like you talked about education being siloed, but a lot of other departments are too. And they've often, when this work is, sort of shoved into education, they'll take care of it. Then the other departments feel like, well, then I don't need to work. I don't need to attend that training session, or I don't need to be part of those conversations. Then you get the whole museum, senior team sitting around a table, and you have an educator or two, and you've got a bunch of other people that haven't spent the time and dedicated to this kind of practice. So yeah, I think so much of this conversation around values is key. Along those lines, I'm obviously super interested in like museum leadership as well. And I loved back in June when you wrote the open letter for the Mass Action blog, you wrote about, you know, sort of the white cisgendered, you know, kind of heteronormative, able-bodied, you know, kind of wealthy museum leadership, you know, individuals that exist in museum leadership. And if museums are a reflection of their leadership, kind of what does that say about where museums are right now? And I'd love you to talk a little bit more about leadership and the role that people at the top of museums. Recently I've been trying not to just call people in executive director positions leaders, because some of them don't really exemplify leadership. But people in those positions, what is their role in this work, in this change work and transformation and liberation work these days?
Yes, and actually, I'm gonna tie that question before about values into this as well. You know, I touched on this briefly, but I'll just be explicit so it's clear. If you have a leader at your institution, you have a value statement. If you have an exhibition schedule at your institution, you have a value statement. It might not be called the value statement, but it is how you are presenting what you value, what you hold to be truth, what you hold to be valuable to your publics. And so I would say that in that framework, we all at every institution have a value statement. I think that leadership and values are explicitly tied. The way that our leaders, and that doesn't necessarily mean the director. There's leadership happening across museum levels. There are leaders that don't have the title leadership, but those who are actively engaging in how the museum presents and impacts its community, all of those leaders are demonstrating the values of the organization. And sometimes those values can be not the same, different across different leaders in the organization. But the work that is coming, especially the work that is coming out externally, is an expression of what the leadership is at that institution. I would say internally as well. You know, the whole beginning of this discussion was about internal practices, about how we work within the museum, hierarchies, departments, siloing departments. All of this is a symptom of good or bad or questionable leadership.
Yes. Yeah. No, so perfect to think about whether you have values statement for your institution or not. And I think many institutions do, but their staff don't connect with those value statements. I mean, maybe an executive director might or something, but I think that there's it would be smart of people in positions of power to sort of reflect on whether their staff feel driven by values. But I think more importantly, what you're talking about is like the actions and like the exhibition schedule, the way that you know, donors are sort of, how does the museum fund itself, fundraising models, all that, those end up really being a stronger statement of values. Like what is the museum, you know, as a value? So yeah, I appreciate that. I want to ask one more thing, and then and I encourage people to keep adding questions into the chat, and then I'll turn it over to Carmel and Sandro too, because I know that they have questions that they want to bring into the conversation, and we'll make sure that we get questions that are coming into the chat as well. My last thing that I want to ask about is right now we're in the middle of what is an amazing program and teach-in that's being organized by Latanya Autry, my co-producer, but beyond that, doing a lot of incredibly important work within museums and arts and culture. Latanya is organizing this Art of Collective Care teach-in, and really one of many people right now that is bringing this idea of care, and especially collective care, into the conversation of museums and institutions and communities. Can you talk a little bit about what that means within this work, and how the relationship of care to this museum kind of founded and originating practice in anti-racism and cultural equity?
Absolutely. Everything that Latanya does is amazing and so grounded in liberation, in collective liberation, which is so important. To me, I connect to this work again through the importance of relationships that I think for far too long museums have sort of exercised their existence as these cold and detached and separate institutions. And really, if we think about a liberated future for museums, to me, that is entirely based in relationships. The relationships with the people who come through the door, the relationships with the people who don't. And I feel connected to Latanya's work in that way, that in different ways, different museum change makers are trying to move the needle out of this place of oppression that museums have occupied since, I think, the invention of museums, into this place of collectiveness, liberation, just betterment for all. I think that those two things are very linked.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Carmel and Sandro to make sure that they can join the conversation. But yeah, thank you so much, Kayleigh.
Okay. First of all, thanks for your presentation. I really liked, what you said. It's music, basically, to my ears, because I'm a transformative educator myself, social justice informed. So one question relates to the relationship between the museum and the state. I don't think we can really understand the racist museum unless we confront the state and interrogate the state. We have racist museums because we have racist states. And of course, from my point of view at least, racism is reproduced through what Gramsci would refer to as the institutions of civil society, or the institutions of the state, be it museums, be it schools, be it the media, etc. So it's very hard, for museums to liberate themselves unless progressive people, anti-racist people infiltrate in a capillary way the museums. So the three questions that I would like to ask to start with, perhaps, is number one, can museums liberate themselves, given this fact? Mm-hmm. And can museums be liberated from outside? And the third question would be, how can movements help museums in this, liberatory vision? In other words, can museums square the circle? Can we have liberatory museums inside a racist state?
Those are really great questions. I will try my best to go somewhere with those. I think first, the reason why I started that really long preamble about museums, the role, the relationship, the response to what is happening in current events is because, and I think that this is a global, or at least a Western issue, that we we have this sort of misguided notion that museums have to be neutral, that museums have no place in current events and certainly no place in politics. And what I was trying to do there is give us this framework that so as goes society, so goes the museum. And so if we are that explicitly linked, then it is our job, it is our work to be involved and to be active participants. And so I think that's the first like mentality issue we have, is that there's this distinction between museum work and politics or current events work, and I think we need to break that down first. Can museums liberate themselves? I absolutely believe that. I don't think I could keep doing this work every day if I didn't believe that. But I think that our ideas of liberation, I think, will definitely vary what we see as liberation. So I am actively engaging in the liberation theory that doing the work is the liberation, that the journey is liberation, not a destination. And so in that framework, I think absolutely every museum can liberate themselves because they will be doing the work that liberates themselves. That is the experience of liberation. That's what that engagement is. And then the liberated museum within an unliberated state, I certainly hope so, because I have, I believe, more faith and more hope for museum liberation necessarily than state liberation. And so I believe that if we are, as the theory says, if we are doing the work every day, then we are experiencing, we are engaging in liberation. And I don't think that that an unliberated state can take that from us if we are committed and dedicated to the work. But it's entirely built into our practice, and it's something that requires us to do a lot of rethinking, a lot of re-strategizing, reconsidering what we value, what is valuable, reconsidering what is work, what does work look like. But I don't think that that in that framework, an unliberated state can take that from you.
Yeah. As a critical pedagogue myself, as a transformative, educator, I often feel, isolated, marginalized, labeled from communist to radical. Do you feel the same there?
Absolutely.
What do you do to keep, your sanity intact?
Yes, absolutely. I have been called radical many times in my career, and there's this new wave of radicals sort of reclaiming that word. But I have been called that word in not in a positive way. I have certainly been siloed in my work and told throughout my career that that these issues of equity are something that I'm experiencing from my own perspective and doesn't exist more broadly. So yes, I would say that I encourage and would love to empower everyone working in museums to be a change maker, but I don't say that that comes lightly, or that you'll be well embraced broadly through the sector if you do so.
So how do you achieve connectedness in this situation, in this context of antipathy,
That's a really great question too. This year, this strange and unpredictable year has really has been an opportunity to question and rethink, and I've really tried to embrace that. The first book that I picked up at the start of the pandemic to read was The Art of Gathering by Priya, because I was thinking about my role as someone who creates gatherings in space. What does that mean if we don't, if it's not safe to do that? And I start there by, starting there had me totally rethinking the importance of relationships and what is a relationship, and how do we engage with visitors, how do we engage with communities, and that I think is the driving force for me right now, is the focus that that even in this time where we can't be physically together, our relationships are still the defining element of our engagements.
COVID has precipitated, the plight of the disadvantaged and marginalized. How are you feeling about, this moment?
This moment, there's so much potential in this moment, because the pandemic is horrible, and I'm not trying to make light of it, but it really is an opportunity for us to just throw out the baggage. I don't think we're going to be given another opportunity like this, where every element of our lives, of our work, of our institutions has been affected. And so I don't think we're going to get another opportunity like this, where we can just say, you know what, let's just start over. And that's where I said, this is the time where we need to be originating an equitable practice. We've been trying to integrate equity into our structures that were never developed from the beginning to be equitable, and that exercise in futility is not getting us anywhere, nor will it ever get us anywhere. And so, I think this is the prime opportunity to say, you know what, we need to stop, throw everything out the window. We need to originate our practice in equity from the ground up, and this is the time to do it.
Sandro.
Kylie, that was so inspiring. I mean, I don't want to add to what Carmel has been asking was those. I mean, I felt very comfortable with those questions. I'd like to ask something a bit more practical, in the sense of grounded in the Mediterranean, and people tend to consider this territory as a former colony, as former colonial territory, and decolonization is not something which has to do with this area, with this territory. On the other hand, we have always considered museums as being focused on a particular topic or a particular narrative, not just in Europe, but also in America. It's African American art, it's European art, it's that type of art, East Asian art, or whatever. If we had to really think about decolonizing collections, so far the discussion has been about returning items, returning artifacts, but perhaps it might be interesting to start to discuss about decolonization in the sense of creating a human-centered collections development practice, like, for example, representing the identities that inhabit a particular land or a particular territory, rather than a history of a particular category. What would be your thoughts about that? Because I feel this is something that in Europe might work, might help us understand what decolonization is really about. It's not about returning artifacts, but it's much more than that. What are your thoughts about it?
Yes, decolonization is of course much more than repatriation, but of course I think repatriation is a strong part of that. When I was talking about objects, so, bringing everything together, values, objects, relationships. I can understand the museum perspective that says, if our greatest value is our objects, then how could we ever repatriate any of the objects in our collection? I can understand that, because if your number one value, your number one priority, the thing that you offer the world, you offer to publics, are objects, then certainly without the objects, what do you have left? But if we change our perspective, that objects are really not the quintessential piece of the museum that makes it a lasting institution, that makes it a worthwhile experience, that makes it a valuable entity in our community, then we don't have to have objects to be a museum. And that's where I say our values need to be reoriented around our relationships. If we have, if our relationship in our community is that we are providing space that doesn't exist, community space that doesn't exist elsewhere, whether that's around healing, around connectedness, around trying to dismantle polarization in our society, whatever that relationship is, then we have a reason to exist that doesn't tie us to objects, and therefore the objects can go back to the communities where they originated, without much of a scandal. So that's where I think our conversation, our discourse around objects and values and relationships really needs to start moving forward more faster. That we need to get to a place where we can that we can understand our role is more than the objects that we hold.
So in that case, I mean, for those who are on the receiving end, who have lost cultural heritage within a colonial context, is it then so necessary to get it back, given that we're talking about a human-centered approach about all these issues? I mean, it's a bit of a provocation here. What would be your thoughts there?
I would say that it's not easy for us to dismiss the importance of discourse around repatriation, because if we think about museums as an invention of colonialism, then museums were an invention of oppressing other cultures and other peoples. And if we are holding on to that as our we are trying to maintain that foundation, then we are colonizers today. And I personally don't want to be a colonizer. I am specifically in museum work to try to actively not be a colonizer. And so I don't think that we can necessarily dismiss that those conversations and the importance of those conversations, even though when we are reorienting our values and repositioning ourselves as humanist-centered, the importance of holding on to those objects will shift. But the original sin of that colonial act of theft is still a legacy that we are responsible for today.
Kylie, can you give us a sense of how you go about doing anti-racist pedagogy inside the museum? Can you share some of your experience with us?
Yes, and so using an anti-racist lens, so that an anti-racist lens is a lens that beyond non-racist is actively looking to dismantle racist policies and structures in our institutions. And so I've used this lens throughout my practice to really speak out about behaviors and norms that we're holding on to that are oppressive in nature. And so really, I think that my practice has been really a practice of resistance, that I am seeking out opportunities that will address and change our culture from within, our internal cultures.
So do you engage with the participants in a dialogical way? How do you go about doing it in practice, you know?
Yes, the examples of the public programs that I presented are dialogue based as well. Dialogic practice has been an essential component to my work throughout my career, and yes, so with that lens turned internally, yes, it begins with conversations. It begins with dialogue, and then but I tried to follow up conversations as quickly as possible with policy change. And so one of the first things that I did at SAM was to establish an inclusion policy for our public programs that would basically hold us accountable to what we're presenting to the public.
I'm very much relieved by the second part of your answer, because as you know, you mentioned the term transformative several times. And of course, you cannot achieve transformation unless you weld the language of critique, which is critical reflection, with the language of possibility, which is action. So I'm truly relieved that I've heard, you know, that your critical engagement or critical reflection would lead to some kind of action in terms of policy and other matters. So yes, that's great.
Thank you.
My last question, Kylie, is inspired by the report published by the American Alliance of 2018, Imagining the Museum in 2040. So my question then would be, what is Kylie Bryant Greenwell's ideal museum in 2040? How would that look like? How would that be?
Across the sector?
Generally, yes.
My ideal vision for the museum sector in 2040 is entirely transformed, so that we would, beginning now, be implementing these new practices. We would be using the opportunity to throw out everything we know now and rebuild from scratch and originate our practice in equity. Museums will look like such valued and essential and meaningful and engaged institutions within community in 2040. You would be able to visibly see the demographics have changed, but you would also see that the engagements and the activities have changed. You would see that that visitors aren't just looking at objects and going to lectures, that they are engaging with each other, that they're coming together to discuss what's going on in the community, to use the museum as a think tank, to create new ideas about bettering the community. It would just, to me, if we start now, in 20 years, we will have a very different field, which is very exciting and hopeful.
It is.
So I guess with this note, Kylie, we bring this webinar to an end. On behalf of the Department of Arts, Open Communities, and Adult Education within the Faculty of Education, I thank you profusely for your thoughts, for sharing your time, your experience, you know, and your wisdom as far as the transformative museum is concerned. I want to thank Mike for being with us all through this webinar series, offering his thoughts, and make the first interventions right after the speaker's thoughts. I want to thank the technical crew based at the University of Malta Valletta campus. In particular, Dr. Joe Van Stel, who was responsible for maintaining, the momentum as far as this webinar is concerned. Also, my fellow colleague, dear friend, and co-anchor of this webinar for making this webinar series a concrete possibility, and for the over 1,000, attendees who were with us through, this webinar series. I want to remind all that this is not the end of the journey. I want to remind all that in January, we will have a call for papers. As you know, we're going to organize an international conference, which is slated for October 2021, and the call for papers will be out sometime in January. So until we meet, we say the local language, Saha, goodbye. And our appointment is for the spring, season, when we start again this webinar series as a run-up to the eventual, international conference. Ciao, and thank you all.